Welcome. Welcome. My name is Nora Jones. I'm the professional development leader for Cheng Tsui, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here on behalf of the whole Cheng Tsui team to this informative and engaging webinar by Dr. Diane Neubauer, Using Comprehension-Based Teaching Strategies in the Asian Language Classroom. Dr. Neubauer, welcome.
Thanks.
I hope you have noticed, everyone that's here today, in her biography, the information that was accompanying the webinar, that Dr. Neubauer has taught Mandarin Chinese for 10 years in elementary, middle, and high schools before completing her PhD in foreign language and ESL education at the University of Iowa in 2022. And she currently serves as clinical assistant professor of multilingual education at the University of Louisville. We are so grateful to you, Dr. Neubauer, for all of your ongoing Chinese instruction and instructional activities and your leadership with ACTFL and with Cheng Tsui. So welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you. Before we begin, dear participants, a few housekeeping items for all of us, please. All attendees will remain muted throughout the webinar so we can keep our focus. But please take note of the Q&A feature that is on your screen. Use the Q&A feature to ask questions, which we will address the last 10 to 15 minutes of this session. We recommend that you ask the questions for the Q&A time in English, because we have a variety of staff who will be presenting the questions to Diane, and that would make it easier for us if you would please. Thank you. Remember, the Q&A is to submit questions to Dr. Neubauer, and we will answer as many as we can live during this webinar. There's also a featured chat. You can use the chat for any technical issues or general comments that are directed to the host and the panelists. Please use the Q&A, though, for questions. A certificate of completion will be sent within 24 hours of completion of this webinar, which you can take to your administration to ask for continuing education credits. We'll also send a recording of the webinar, a PDF of this presentation, which is usually a question that we get asked, and a 20% discount code good for throughout March for her ebook, Comprehension-Based Chinese. The email will also include a link to a post-webinar survey. Please take a few minutes to fill it out. It will help inform us for the development of future webinars. And now, I'd like to turn with great pleasure to Dr. Diane Neubauer for her presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nora. I am really excited to be here and thankful for the opportunity to share about comprehension-based teaching strategies and thinking especially of Mandarin Chinese classes, such as those that I teach. Even now, I teach online part-time, just as a fun side thing. But I'm also aware that we have other language teachers here, particularly Japanese language teachers, and I will aim to be relevant to you as well. So let me begin with an overview of my agenda for the evening. So I'll begin by giving you a sense of my overall teaching approach and the goals that I have. And we'll talk through a teaching sequence that I've found effective, particularly thinking of Asian languages and character-based languages in particular, languages that have a script very different from an alphabet. And we have some special case needs with reading as a result. Then we'll talk about two strategies that I find really effective in reaching those goals, and that fit into the sequence in kind of in three places. It's sort of 2.5 strategies. I'll talk about picture talk as a strategy for developing the establishing a meaning, understanding new words in context, and then developing listening comprehension in a broader context of communicative use of the language. And then reading together, a strategy that's a whole class activity, developing new reading skills that will then build towards more independent reading skills. And then we'll talk through the online platform for the ebook that all of this content is in. and show other features of that ebook and how it works. And then we'll have time we're aiming for about 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers at the end. So let's begin. So my overall teaching approach aligns with goals for students to have language proficiency, to acquire language, to have unrehearsed, unmemorized ability to understand what they hear, what they read, to be able to speak to people in an appropriate way, in an appropriate setting, and to be able to communicate through written texts as well. So I'm not as concerned about discrete grammar knowledge. I don't need my students to tell me about the language. I really want them to be able to use the language. And by use, I mean understand as at least as much as I mean produce. So I think in terms of a comprehension-based approach, where my understanding of how we gain an additional language is based on comprehension of that language in context. So we scaffold, we help make sure we're checking that students actually understand rather than just that I think they should, do they really? Because their comprehension is something that is building the language in their own mind over time as we work with them. So the next principle that I have is that I want to be communicative in the use of the language, both in the classroom and preparing students for out of the classroom use of the language. So this means things like a short way to think of communicative use of language or a communicative purpose is, are we using this language right now in the classroom to do something other than practice language or learn language? So I'm going to say that again because it's a big mind shift in language teaching where we've often really thought about things in terms of, here's my list of vocabulary, here's my list of grammar. I want to make the students get that. And I'm suggesting that we focus on a different goal, on communication as a goal, and we let the words and the grammar that we need to do that come up when we need it. Impossible. We may have a sequence that we're following, but we can still organize things so that we're using that language to do something other than just learn language or just practice what they've learned. So we might do something like get to know about the people in the classroom. We're learning about each other. So that's a communicative purpose. We might learn about the world, maybe target language cultures and communities, maybe other communities, maybe our students' home communities and cultures. So there's another one. We might be learning about subject matter, like a cross-curricular type of a project where we're learning science through the language, or we're learning about stories and reading literature in the language, or scaled down versions of stories from the target cultures. We might also be imaginative in the language and play with the language by creating an imagined scene, creating a story together or independently. All of those are communicative purposes for language. Besides, I mean, they'll learn language through that, but it's not aimed here, it's aimed here. Up at communication with the language pieces to follow that purpose. And then I think in terms of more of an approach and not a method. So I'm thinking of general principles that I want to apply more flexibly. I'm not telling you tonight that you must do this, and then you must do this, and then you must do this. I'm saying here are principles, here are a bunch of strategies that fit those principles, and then you can adapt to your students, to their proficiency level, and to their interest. And so it's also flexible and student involved. So each time I teach, things feel a little bit different, even though I'm applying these same principles, lots of student comprehension of the new language that they're gaining with a communicative purpose in mind. But I'm flexible about that. Younger children need more concrete activities. Adults sometimes hesitate in being quite as silly, and they want to explore the world a little more deliberately right away. things like that. So you as a teacher too, your teacher personality and your teacher preferences matter. If you're not enjoying yourself in the classroom, you are very unlikely to help students enjoy it. So I try to make sure everybody in the room there is involved in the process of what we're doing. In thinking about sequencing instruction, then, I've found this is an adaptation of sort of the classic version of TPRS in some respects in terms of coming up with steps. So I'll give credit there. It's modified from that, and it's more flexible than that, I would say. So I do think in terms of when I have some new words, oh, and one thing to say, it's not important that you try to read the small text. This is a infographic in the book created by my friend Nan Ta, who recently was awarded the Regional Teacher of the Year for Southwest Cult. If you're in ACTFL, I'm very proud of her. So she made this for me. But the purpose here is not to get into the detail, but to show the sequence. So the first thing we're doing is establishing meaning with some new words, maybe a phrase, not many at a time. So I'm thinking maybe one new phrase, and I'm going to work with it for a little bit, maybe only a few minutes, and just stay really close to that new word or phrase, asking questions, describing things. We'll see an example of how I might do that with pictures in a moment. So that's step one. That might take a few minutes up to a whole class period. It depends on the age of your students. You're watching them and their response, their comprehension, and their emerging ability to produce language to determine when you proceed to the next step. Step two then is massive auditory input. And here I should credit Ben Slavic for that term. He helped me to see teaching in this way. Like, what did I really want to focus on first was developing their listening comprehension, their ability to understand the new word in the context of other words they already know. So they're building a listening proficiency through this. So we're going to move a little bit away from just focused on one word or phrase to putting that into context of a story, a description, a discussion, a conversation, something that involves all other language that they've learned. So by doing that, we're not just doing sequencing where there's a unit and then it falls away and now there's another unit and then we go on to the next unit and we have another. It's more like a growing cloud. So you're beginning to learn words and phrases that continue to be relevant to later times when you talk, and you're just building on that. So those are the first two steps. When I'm looking at students, I want to see, like, where are they with these newly introduced words? Am I seeing them confidently able to answer questions that include those words? Are some students starting to produce those words in context appropriately? And then I know we're ready to start to read. At these two stages in Chinese classes, I'm using pinyin. So I use a phonetic script while those words are new, with students up to about intermediate low proficiency. So students who can speak in series of sentences, I'm still probably introducing new words in a phonetic script. In the case of Japanese or another more a syllabary or an alphabetic language that is different from an English script, I would be, for the very beginner, I would be using Romaji, or I would be using a familiar set of letters so that we're quickly getting the meaning of words. And what we're doing is we're connecting the sound to the meaning. And again, they're hearing those words, connecting the sound to the meaning in the communication in our classroom. Sound to meaning, sound to meaning. And I'm starting to see, like, oh, I'm seeing it kind of gel. Now they're ready to see it in writing, in written form. And I begin that process with a third step that I called massive reading input with the whole class. So now we're going to be reading with a lot of support. Choral reading, which has been found in research, particularly in Chinese language, to be an effective means of helping develop reading proficiency. So there's a lot of support from the class, for each other, and from the teacher. I'll demonstrate a strategy that fits this in a moment. And then the fourth step is moving into semi-independent reading. So students at this point, I'm looking again, I'm diagnosing what's happening in each of my students. We're moving from this very heavily supported, scaffolded reading towards a task that they now do more on their own, perhaps with a partner, perhaps with a small group, maybe independently entirely. And they're rereading something similar to what they did here as a whole class, but they're doing it in a more independent way. It's a way I can kind of still moderate and check that my students are doing okay. They have tools to be more independent, but may not be ready to fully read. In this process, I am also pointing out little bits of form in the characters that they're seeing. So we do work on specific character knowledge, but we're moving from comprehension of language using that nice strong sense of language comprehension as we begin to read the text. So they're matching up that sound to meaning. How does that look? And then they're beginning to prepare to be independent readers and readers of those words in all kinds of contexts. So we're developing reading proficiency as well. This is 4 steps. It might mean that this is 2 days of class in a school where we have 4 or 5 days of class per week. This might be another 2 or 3 days of class. Again, I'm thinking middle school, high school. If you teach elementary, very little learners, you might need to spend more time here, especially if you only see them 1 time a week. So you want to be very careful about when you begin the reading step, in my opinion, because you want to make sure they have a strong listening comprehension before you add that extra task for their mind to begin to read. So that's the basics of where we're headed. We'll now look at the strategy. I said there was 2.5 strategies. So the first one is one that can fit into that first step, establishing meaning, using a few new words very closely. And then in step 2 as well, we can do a more expanded, involved version of picture talk in step 2, and it gets a little bit more broad, a little more imaginative. So I have an example image. Typically, for picture talk, I will prepare about 10 to 20 pictures. Sometimes photos is my favorite. I will often search for photos using both English and using my target language. So I use Chinese. This allows me to see pictures that might have been taken by people who speak Chinese and who speak English. And so I might get some photos that are familiar to my students and some that might be culturally new. And so I like to show some of both. So I would use a series of pictures that has something similar about it, perhaps. It might tell sort of a sequence of a story, and that becomes moving from picture talk towards a strategy called clip chat or video and discuss or a modified movie talk. But for this, I'm thinking of just a single photo. And this is the photo that I wanted to share. So let's say I'm introducing a new term such as like in the park. And I'll use English right now because I know we have multiple languages teachers here. In my classroom, I am using Chinese, right? So I may have on a whiteboard, I may write 在公园里 here in pinyin, and then I might put an equal and I'd put in the park. And as I use those new words, I would point to the English meaning again and again as I'm beginning to talk about this picture. So I might say something, so that's how I would include the target language here. So I'm going to use English now, just so we all understand for the purpose of the webinar, not how I teach in class, right? My English use is in print. I'm not usually saying anything in English. I'm letting them see it in reading. My students can read English. If yours are very, very little, you might use a little more spoken English at this point. Or you let them struggle a little bit and they start to realize like, okay, and then you talk about the parks in their town, the park next to the school, all of these things. So I might say something like, here is a person in the park. Do you recognize the person who's in the park? And I'd wait for my students. Some might think, wait, is that you? Yeah, that's me. That's me. I'm in the park. Where do you think the park is? Is this in our town? Am I in a park in our town or not? So they're maybe thinking about that. They're trying to interpret the meaning of this picture. In other words, my purpose is to help them think through what they're seeing and interpreting that. I would then be able to move on and ask questions about, oh, look, this picture, these people are also in the same park that I was in with the same elephant. Who is this person in the park? Do you know this person by name? It's Mao Zedong. And so he was in a photo taken at the same elephant. So I thought, I need to have a photo of this same elephant. So that would be the way I would continue. If I was doing step 1, I would only use familiar language, familiar words and phrases, except that new phrase in the park or in the same park. In English, it comes out a little different. In Chinese, it would be more similar in some cases. So that would be more of a step 1 version. For a step 2 version, I might then just transition right into it. I might focus in on a few new words and phrases, 3 or 4 for a few minutes, talking about the elephant, talking about something else maybe came up that I need them to be able to understand and be able to use. And we'll talk about that, pointing to the picture and looking at that. For step 2, I might do something like, okay, imagine I am in the park. Why am I in the park? And here I'm depending on my students' proficiency level, I might be asking something more scaffolded than that, something like, do you think I'm in the park for a picnic? Or am I in the park to meet someone? And I see the class, they can tell me which one. Now our communicative purpose is to create a story together. And so we're going to go with what maybe the students say. I can continue to use the new phrases as we develop this little story. And so I can spend 5 minutes, I might spend 20 minutes, depending on what happens with this story. Maybe they decide I'm meeting someone in the park. Who am I going to meet? Who am I going to meet in the park? Am I meeting, and I get suggestions from the students. Oh, okay, are they in the park? Are they over there in the park? I'm here at the elephant. Ooh, maybe we wanted to meet at the elephant in the park, but the other person doesn't remember or something. So we're getting some kind of imaginative scene. Again, that language is used in context again and again as we proceed. So that's picture talk, both as step 1 and as step 2. The other possible things, I have had students draw pictures. This one says, I'm going across the street. And then this says diner in English. This is with permission. I got to use this in the book from a student of mine in middle school some years ago. This turned out to be one of the best things. He drew a picture that was based on some discussion that we had. I developed this, I called it, I think, listen and draw at the time, because my students were very reluctant to do anything else that day. I wanted them to engage, and they just weren't going anywhere. So another strategy I used was listen and draw. Then we could use those drawings and talk about them the next day. In this case, they were more familiar with what was happening in the picture. Let's say I showed it to a class that didn't know what had happened yet. I'm like, oh, okay. So in the picture, what do you see? Again, maybe we're maybe using the phrase going across the street. So, okay, here's a person. Oh, the person has something here. Is the person going across the street for a reason? What reason is the person going across the street? What else do you see in that? If a student group is at a higher proficiency level, I might ask more open-ended questions about that. So I would scaffold less. Why questions, how questions, prediction questions, opinion questions. Would you go to that diner and eat? Look, they have milkshakes. Do you Do you like to drink milkshakes? Would you go to this diner and drink a milkshake? Will he? Will he? You know, and so we're building an imaginative scene through the use of our language together. So another way to carry out picture talk. I'm going to get a little sip and I'll talk about the next strategy. So for step 3 now, again, I'm looking through step 1 and 2 activities, maybe 1 full day of class, maybe 2. It depends on my schedule, my learners, their progress. I'm watching for their comprehension. And at this time, before I begin step 3, what I want to see is that students are not really struggling to understand what they hear. They're comfortably showing good comprehension. And some students, maybe not all, are spontaneously producing those new words and phrases introduced through step 1 and 2. So at step 3 now, we're not going to overburden their working memory. We're going to just be adding one piece so that sound and meaning is nice and firm. We're adding the way that it looks. So in step 3, then, this is one example. This is my first strategy for step 3, reading together. In this, I will have a text that is already prepared. So it will be quite long. I borrow from principles that Terry Waltz developed for cold character reading. And so her approach there is to use quite a long text that embeds the new words and phrases into that text many times, 10 to 20 times, but uses the language meaningfully. It's not just repeating the same sentence, it's telling a story, it's expressing an argument, it's describing something, it's introducing a cultural topic about the target culture. Any of those things could be used as a text, but the goal is to encounter those new words many times in context, so that while we're doing this very supported, scaffolded thing, they're starting to recognize them, and we're building the skills that they'll continue to develop on their own in semi-independent reading steps. So I'm going to show a reading slide that might be one of 20 slides that I would show with students. It's about 20 sentences is a good length, I think, perhaps, where I'm trying to use those new words and phrases at least 10 times each, or having them read a shorter text for different reasons multiple times, so they encounter those words at least 10 to 20 times. Because in Chinese script, we don't have phonetic indication of what those are. So you'll notice I don't have it here. Why don't I have pinyin here? My friend Jared Turner at Mandarin Companion has a wonderful blog post about this. The reason is that my alphabetic trained mind cannot stop seeing pinyin. And if I need to be able to interpret meaning from the characters directly, I need to have the pinyin separated away. So I saw pinyin in steps 1 and 2. In steps 3 and 4, I'm not. In the case of Japanese or Thai or Cambodian or Khmer or something else that has a different script from English, and I'm now ready to introduce reading to students, likewise, I would show no more phonetic script. I would just show the script that I want to use. In the case of Japanese, do you want to use kanji now or just hiragana or both hiragana, katakana? I hear some debates about that. You could use the kanji right away if you wanted, because of the way that we're going to scaffold this. Ask it as a question in Q&A if you have more interest in my developing that point. For Chinese, though, I can tell you there's not a reason for me to use pinyin together with characters. Some teachers use pinyin texts as a separate item and read the pinyin text. Sure. I have not found it necessary. Partly, I want to get to this reading quickly so that students feel the power of reading in a character language quickly. And they do. They are, the first time we do this reading, it wouldn't look this big. It wouldn't have this many new words. It would be simpler. There would be more scaffolded pictures. There would be even bigger font. And I would go very slowly, and then I would point as I go. a student who is used to this in a class where we've been reading together a lot, I would ask a student to point instead, and they will pace. So we're now going to read chorally together. So I'm going to say it in English so everybody knows what it means. But in class, would I be using English at this point? No, I would be reading this with them in Chinese. I would let my voice stay silent for the words and phrases where they don't need my support anymore. So I'm listening for a strong response from students whenever possible. So let's say this is a new term that they're going to see the first time in reading here. I'll show you what would happen. So I'm going to signal them, I'm listening. They're telling me he doesn't have friends. He at home has many. And now I hear maybe one student go, things to do, tasks. So that maybe some of them are going to figure it out because they're tracking the meaning of that sentence. They might be able to estimate. We just used that term in those step 1 and 2 activities, preparing them for this very reading. So they might be able to start even predicting. Sometimes they can't. I fill in. I say 事情, and they go, oh, that's how it looks. Oh, that's how it looks. And then we continue on. We read the sentence there. We continue to the end of the slide. If I'm showing a whole document, I would block it out. So I just show about one line of text. So it's not overwhelming. Just one at a time is plenty for them to be thinking about. For this reading approach to work, they don't need to see the whole text the whole time. They can see just 1 or 2 sentences and another 1 or 2 and another 1 or 2 on different slides that we show. So I might, at this point, we're reading mostly just reading for comprehension and to start to recognize these new words in context, but I might do a little check now and then, something about a little focus on form where I think that maybe students will get confused in the meaning. Maybe here I might want to double check that this phrase is a little different. He has a lot of tasks, needs himself to do. And so we might, how would you say that in smoother English? Oh, he has to do them by himself. Yeah, like the song he's listening to. So I might do a check on the meaning. I might do a little bit of a prediction question. At this point, it doesn't fit as well, but I might ask an opinion question like, oh, do you have a lot of tasks that you must do by yourself or do yourself? And see like, oh, I have homework, or like getting a little bit of a comparison to the students so that we're getting to know the students while we're understanding the text. So that's one example. This one was a student drawing, again, by permission, where I think this was like a second time we were reading. So this was also a way that I could build them towards independent reading. We might read together once, and then they did some captions, or illustrations, rather. This is another format for reading. I used quick slides for this one. It's an online place where you can put in the whole text. Everywhere you have an enter, it gives you a new slide. Very handy. For some reason today, or recently, I have not found it to work, but you can see how many slides I have for a sense of how long is this reading. Each one of those dots is 1 or 2 sentences. And then there are follow-up activities that we would do after that kind of reading together. So, yeah, I'm going to take a little sip and then we'll be ready to shift towards a look at the online platform. So the things that I've shared are contained in an ebook called Comprehension-Based Chinese, and it's entirely and only on the Fluency Link platform that Cheng Tsui uses. So if you are a Chinese teacher and you also have some other textbook in Fluency Link, that's where it would appear. I am going to share my screen so that I can demonstrate that. Oh, I have one thing. I have it open. I was going to show you what it looks like when you first log in. So let me go back to that page. Yeah. Okay, one moment. Okay, I'm ready to share screen. Okay, so here is the Fluency Link platform and my cursor. Hopefully you can follow my cursor there. I'm going to click the login. I've already entered my username and password. And the first thing you see is the library. So in the library, I only have my book is there. And you can click if you had other books or a textbook series by Cheng Tsui, it would also appear here. So I follow that. And then the first thing will be the page that I just had open. My last time here, I wanted to start with the cover page. So I closed it when I had it on the cover page. If you were in step 2, strategy 5, and you closed this and then you reopened it, it would start you on the same place you left off. So I'm going to show some of the features of the platform, and then we'll look inside the book. Over on the left, there's a contents. I think this is the easiest way to get around inside the book. So you could see title, page, and the usual opening there. I acknowledge some colleagues who helped me with the book, but also my students who really drove me to become a better teacher. So, I didn't mean to jump there, but there we go. So you could see how fast it can jump even when I'm on a webinar. Their table of contents, I wanted to show a little bit. And if you're thinking, oh no, that's so small. If you look on the right, there is a full screen option that will make it larger. I'm going to skip that for now so that I can still see all my webinar features. There's also a zoom, and you can click and drag the page. You can make it really big if you want to. And then on each page, let's say you're looking and you're thinking, well, I know I need to do some things to introduce new words and phrases more effectively. What could I try? You might look at the list and think, okay, I want to be sure to use more gestures. And so you can leave yourself a little mark and highlight it. You can erase that mark. This will stay available to you when you open the book again until you erase it. If I close the tools, it will hide it. But if I open the tools again, it comes back. So let's say you're displaying something to students, you can easily circle, highlight, but you can turn it off too. It's really handy. So you can see there's several strategies for the first step, establishing meaning. Oh, and now I need to switch to my page grabber. A number of steps for step 2, massive auditory input. And some more over there with some examples. Inside each of these steps, there are, well, not each of these steps, but many of these steps have a link to a video of me or possibly another teacher doing this strategy. So you can watch them in an actual class doing the task that is described. And then this perspective on reading describes why am I thinking the way I am about reading? How does it proceed? What are some cautions and some concerns about making that work? What kind of a text do you want for that? And then I describe the third step, massive reading input, where you're reading aloud with the class. So it's a whole class activity. And then step 4 follows with lots of strategies that are for independent or semi-independent reading. Again, it could be that students are working in groups or pairs, or they might be independent, but they can seek help. And then there are a number of questions that we have, particularly in Chinese language classes, but I think also in other Asian language classes about some of these issues, cultural issues of adapting to the school. How do I tell my students how I'm teaching and why? What about culture? What about handwriting? How do we incorporate those kinds of goals? How do I adapt to different students and manage the classroom effectively? And then there's a list of just the internet resources and the references that I have. I do have some reference to research in this, but it is mainly a practitioner handbook. So it's full of ideas for instruction, not just about theory. So in Like, so that's the walkthrough of the table of contents. I find it most convenient to go back to here to figure where I want to go. So you can go by page though, too. You can enter the page right there and go straight to the page if you know which one you want. What I wanted to show on the table of contents first was if I were reading this, what I would suggest someone reading it do first is kind of see what's in it and then read the introduction. The introduction gives a little bit of my philosophy of how does this all fit together? Why have I approached this? How did I learn to teach this way? This is not the way I was taught language, and it's been a number of years of trial and error. And why do I think that's worth doing? So that's the introduction. And then there's the strategies here where I think they're like a cookbook where you have first course items and then you have second course items and then desserts is a section. You don't read through each and every dessert and try to do them all on the same meal. So these are ones where you can choose, you can find one that's a little simpler to begin from and explore it, try it again. I suggest trying things 3 times before you decide, no, this really isn't for me. It's not working out. Let me try a different strategy. So doing those things, not necessarily every single week the same way, but trying them out a little bit and then determining which ones work for you and making the adaptations you need. So I would read that introduction, kind of jump around in the step sections. I would read the perspective on steps 3 and 4 on reading. I would read that one closely as well, and then jump around for steps 3 and 4. And I would read the frequently asked questions as well, because they so often are questions that come up about teaching the languages we have. Other features here in the platform include the bookmarks. So I marked where the step 1, strategy 5, look and discuss, and you could see I have an annotation there, which I can turn off if I want, but that I had marked it. So like, aha, here I am. So there's several pages about that. It's meant to read like a good cookbook where it's talking about what I have tried, why I'm doing something that I'm doing, some suggestions for ways to carry this out, and then a specific example throughout, both in the text, so in the Chinese, and then for readers of this book who do not read Chinese, because I know some other languages teachers have also been interested, I also have an English translation of that. I don't show that to students, of course. We're learning Chinese and they get a little help from English now and then, but I'm not presenting them with the translation, right? And then some ways to continue from that, ways to get the images. And one of the fun ones was I had students who had computers where they could send me. We had a system that was called Dino, I think, at one of the schools I taught, and they could send me their image. So I could give them the phrase and they would find a picture or two they found interesting. And then we'd talk about their images. It was great. There was a student who loved Nicolas Cage, and he would find all these photos of Nicolas Cage doing that thing for Chinese class, and it became a running joke, and it was fabulous. So there are a lot of ways to get the images that you discuss, in other words. Let's see if this one, yeah. I have suggestions throughout for online teaching as well and adapting to an online platform because that's where I teach Chinese now. That one does not have a video example of me actually doing that step. Many of the others do. So either a video from my high school class, sometimes from another context where I was teaching, occasionally another teacher who is doing that strategy. So bookmarks are a handy way if you know, like, okay, I want to use this strategy and this one, you can just bookmark it and jump right to those when you need them. If you, like during class, you want to go and consult what happens next, you could do that. There's a place for your own notes, which I have added some notes about some proofreading things, which I'll have to tell the Cheng Tsui staff about sometime. There's highlights you can do. Oh, and then the last thing, if you wanted a 2-page view, that is also an option. You can show 1 or 2 pages at the same time. So I think I have shown everything that I wanted to display about the ebook. So I'm going to stop share and come back, and I'm right on the timing that I hoped for. This is great. So thank you. 谢谢. Arigatou gozaimasu for coming tonight. ขอบคุณค่ะ if you're Thai. And thanks for attending. I'm interested in your questions. This sheet has some clickable links, and that will be shared in the email follow-up. The PDF of my presentation slides will also be shared in the follow-up. So since you are here and you registered, you'll have that email within 24 hours, I believe Nora said.
So
I'll-
Diane, are you ready for some questions?
I am. Let me sip some more tea.
We have quite a few, and I'm combining some, but let's start with actually in a chronology that you used. The first question that came was about the steps of establishing meaning and using massive auditory input and your observation thereof. And the question is, I tend to do steps 1 and 2 together in an integrated manner. Are there benefits to separating them, and what are your thoughts about integrating those 2 steps?
Yeah, I do that too. I integrate them, but I can say when I first started teaching in this way, where I was really aiming at a really immersive like experience for students, heavy amounts of the target language, like ACTFL suggests 90% plus target language use in the classroom and beyond it, if we can. So if I'm really trying to aim for that, I needed it broken down more simply. And that step 1 made it something that I could ensure my students were ready to proceed to step 2 without getting lost. Because I wasn't very good at step 1 stuff mixed in with step 2. I got better over time, and now I am more flexible. Oh, that question reminds me of something else too. I had those 4 steps. After that first week of class, I also end up using a little bit of reading back before we start another round, another sequence of step 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm trying to revisit just every day a little bit of the reading that they've done now independently, get them a sentence or 2 that shows them those words again so that they're still building that retention over time.
Thanks, Diane. And the follow-up to that was about the listening experience, great for comprehension. Wondering about output, especially oral output. How do you build students' tone sensitivity? And what are your strategies for ensuring tone accuracy?
Excellent. Okay. So I have mostly those first 2 steps and waiting. That's a simple way to describe it. And what I mean by waiting is inviting and celebrating when students are seeking to communicate with me in Chinese and not doing error correction unless I can't understand what they meant. So I am trying to scaffold things so that what novice, low, beginner, total beginner learners can do with the language is pretty reduced. So I let them head nod, head shake. They don't have to produce sentences in full sentences right away. They don't even have to say words right away at that very, very beginner level. What I want them to be doing is hearing and building an ear for the way that Chinese sounds. And so that when they do start to produce the sounds, they are going to be much more like an understandable native-like production. And I've seen this happen a lot. And I understand that this is not the way that most of us learn Chinese. As a second language learner, I didn't learn it that way. I was drilled. And my Chinese pronunciation was not very good and I know that because a year after having instruction that was very drilled, he showed us diagrams of our mouths and where to put our tongue. I was speaking Chinese to people 1 year after that course, and they had a very hard time understanding me. I got an A in the course, but the people in the real world couldn't understand what I said. So that tells me that this drilling and that heavy explicit emphasis on pronunciation is not the best way, most efficient way to get it. So what I find is by them hearing so much language all the time in the classroom, their production is naturally better. When it's not quite right, And I think this is going to confuse a native speaker, because I understand, because I'm their teacher, I'm with them all the time. If I think that others will be either offended by the way that they say something or confused by the way they say something, I will do a little quick focus on it. So I might do something like, 喜欢 is a really classic. That's X. The X sound in pinyin is something like that. And so it's not a sound we have in English. It does take time. And sometimes they'll mix that up with the SH sound. Sh. So because we don't have either in English, I'll contrast them. Like, okay, which one am I saying? Is it the X or SH? And I do that maybe for half a minute. And then maybe the next week we do that again. And then let's say I hear students are confused about either recognizing a word by sound or they're having a hard time producing it. We might do just a little bit of a quick contrast. Here's one. C in Chinese is tricky. It's like a TS sound, though, in English. It's quite similar to that. So what I have them do to do just quick focus on form practice, cats, and then go cats. Oh, that's the sound. Now I can do it at the beginning because you found the spot with your tongue and then you could do it. So I fold those little tiny little bits when we need it, when I see that there's kind of a persistent thing going on. I don't think that fossilization is really that big of a threat. What I mean by that is in some teaching methods, like audiolingual method, the belief was that if you produce the language in an unnative like production, it doesn't sound like somebody who speaks the language well would say it. It used to be thought that if you don't get it right away, you'll never get it. And then you'll be frozen in that. I don't find that to be the problem in this type of teaching because they're hearing the language so much. If I was doing a very production-based teaching and they were producing, and they weren't hearing it as much and they weren't letting it kind of sink in and really develop a sense of the sound system first, yeah, you could fossilize. But with this approach, I don't find it to be a big problem at all. There are some videos of my students in a speaking assessment that are on my YouTube channel. If you looked up my YouTube channel is under my name, Diane Neubauer. And if you look up speaking assessments, you can see students and I list how many hours of class they had and how they sounded. And they never had drilled anything about how to pronounce Chinese. They just, I mean, we did a little bit, that little tiny bit occasionally, but mostly no. So that's my long answer, but I'm passionate about that one because it is a question that comes up a lot. The tones then, one more thing about tones, that recognizing tones, like I can hear that word and I know what it means and I feel the tone and I can match it when I produce it. That is an implicit skill. It's a skill that you don't have conscious knowledge of very well. Conscious knowledge of tones and being able to say, that's a second tone, that's a fourth tone, and identifying it by name is a different thing. That's explicit knowledge about the tones. I don't mind if students don't develop explicit knowledge about the tones until later, if they're curious. So I want them to be able to communicate in Chinese, both listening and speaking, reading, writing, and then I don't mind if they can't identify and talk about the language. So that wasn't my goal. If you need to have that be your goal, you can introduce it, but I say, wait till they have that implicit knowledge. And then you can say like, oh, see that, hear that when you're doing that, that's second tone. And they go, oh, that's what that is? Oh.
Do you assess vocabulary tests, tonal accuracy?
Oh, like writing the tone marks accurately? I do not, because we don't have to when we type. Now typing, that was the main reason I used to. It used to be that typing required you to know the tone accurately or you wouldn't get the right character. But now computers and phones are really good at it. You can just start even just the first couple letters and it'll predict based on frequency which word you might need. So I do not, it's not a goal that I have.
Thank you, Diane. Got a couple of questions that were on the nature of the picture talk
Oh yeah.
prompt.
Mhm.
And one of them had to do with how do you work effectively and efficiently with limited time in the week.
Mhm.
And another person was asking about making sure that all students are engaged. How do you make sure that they all get engaged in this experience?
Mhm.
Only a few seem to participate.
Right. Those are great questions. And I my short sassy answer will be it depends. You will be the expert in your classroom and you'll find the tricks that work. But I'll give you a better answer than that. But I can't say for sure which thing will work for you, but I can give you some ideas and you can try them and you'll find, as you are the language teacher and the expert in that classroom, you'll be able to find something that works better. You might even ask students, what do you want to do so that I can tell you understand what we're doing during this class? Making sure that they do know what is it that you want them to be doing. This kind of activity feels different if they had a teacher who did textbook exercises that were very controlled. Using language for communication is a little messy, and they might feel a little anxious about it, to be honest. Some of my students have expressed that. So helping them know that what is your goal, what things are you looking for them to do? And so the first time I talk with students in Chinese is on day one, and I'll tell them it's okay if you just answer me like this or like this, but I want to see you respond every time something happens. Every time I'm looking for answers, I need a response. And waiting calmly and gently for that kind of response, it might mean that you wait a long time. There's a limit, perhaps. There's other strategies you might try, and that is using whiteboards. If you have a small whiteboard they can use, or just writing on the board in the classroom if you have enough space, or doing something with a drawing, having them show you a response instead of speaking a response might be helpful. Giving them hand signals, so thumbs up, thumbs down. Maybe there's other signals that you would do. Move in the room, like move to that side if you think this. Move to that side of the room if you think that. And they move to show you their response. Those kinds of ideas can be helpful.
Thank you so much, Diane. And with the limited time we have two really big,
Mhm.
like research kinds of things.
Oh,
One
awesome.
of them keeps coming up is about finding more information about massive auditory input, for
Mhm.
example. And the
Yeah.
other question that came up over and over again, and is, I'm sure, quite complicated to answer, is that balance of learning the Chinese character, for example, or the
Mhm.
incorporation of hiragana, katakana, and kanji, and the balance of that type of writing. So
Mhm.
many high schoolers, in this particular case, are mentioning that just want to read pinyin.
Mm.
How do you encourage that? And I know you have
Yeah.
just a little bit of time to wrap that up, but potentially the
Sure.
resources that you're sharing have some information about that too.
Yes, yes. I think a big key for helping students feel more comfortable and confident reading in characters is doing those things that we do as a whole class, and seeing that the reading is closely tied to the things they did in listening comprehension. I have an example in the book, I think, where students were, I printed, because I wanted to print it one day in Chinese 1, I printed a longer reading on a page, and literally a student saw it and went, oh, because it's discouraging for them to see like such a long text. But in the story, he saw the names of this cat that they made up in their story, and he saw that I had those names in it. I used the names in English so they could easily see them. And he went, oh, wait, this is about our cats? Oh, okay. And that fast, it doesn't always work that beautifully, but that was an example. So making sure that they know that you are there to support them, that the reading is something that I know that you're ready for, that like there's a lot of little things you can do to encourage that. In the research ideas, check in, well, I didn't list it here. My academic website has some information about research that I've done. I've written some papers on different issues of Chinese reading, particularly, and my dissertation was about Chinese classrooms with novice learners where they were using the target language in these ways. So that might be a place to check in Google Scholar. If you look me up, so Google Scholar is the site, and look up Diane Neubauer Chinese, and you probably will get something from me on that.
That's fantastic. Diane, that was a masterful ending there with very little time, and we do want to make sure that we keep to our promise of the 1 hour webinar. Remember, everyone, dear participants, be looking for the follow-up email. There's links to the PowerPoint, to the presentation, to the contact links that Diane is sharing here, to the survey, information about her online book there, which can be read there. There's been so many questions about that, Diane, and
Oh, fun.
so much interest in your book.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, we appreciate you, and I know that not everyone got all of their questions or some of the sharing that they wanted to make, but we do have all of those recorded as part of this webinar. We'll be taking a look at it as a team, and I know that you, Diane, with all of your skill sets, will probably be glad to follow up in whatever way you can based on your own time
Yep.
constraints.
Yep. And yeah, I'm happy to receive emails, and I will seek to respond as much as I can to those.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Again, we'll
Yeah,
be
thank you all.
communicating, everyone. So thank you so much for being here. Dr. Neubauer, thank you so much for everything that you've shared.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Nora, for running that, and for those who also helped you with the questions.
The fantastic team effort. And on behalf of the whole Cheng Tsui team, thank you everyone for being here. Take care. We look forward to seeing you again in future webinars.